Good afternoon, everybody. I thought I might start with a safety warning. I noticed Ray almost tripped up these stairs. They're non-standard, so everybody be warned, the stairs are non-standard. Having said that, let me talk a little bit about print quality. I've delivered a number of talks, and I've had the honour of 42 kids at Space Camp. That was an incredible adventure. I want to thank John Osler last year for allowing me to play Blondie and Gutenberg, and also that journey that it took me into learning more about print, learning about the letterpress stuff. But today is more a little bit of focus on quality and printing to standard, and my old favourite, the colour gamut. I'll never let that one go. And I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about ink. And our journey from letterpress days to offset. But this particular slide I've shown you before, and I really like this one. An 8x10 photograph is 126,000 pixels of one colour, or 500,000. Now, the important thing that we need to recognise in our printing process is we don't print different shades. We print one shade, and we use the screen ruling to make the shades trick the eye. We forget about that because we see the picture, just the same as we create it in a situation where our people who read the paper see the picture. Of course, our process is captured by cameras, RGB to CMYK. We need profiles, and there's going to be a session tomorrow morning on profiling the press. And I've shown you in the past this very simple profile, where we have our white space going through at our solids and just basically saying to you that's the way we step through in colour. But again, let me say, we're only printing a solid and putting white spaces in between it. That's how we get our little steps in between. And we use the term profile. Who's actually ever seen a profile? Well, let me show you the newsprint profile. I've actually downloaded. This is the ISO 26-2004. And it's a very simple lookup table. We have the screen rulings, we have the XYZs, oh hang on, that's the RGB measurements, and we have the LAB numbers. And my very first presentation to SWUG is what is LAB? Because LAB is the language of communication of colour. I'm sorry I'm sounding repetitive. But I'd also like to challenge you with this particular slide, which this is a scan of a print. I want to point out with the dot game we've got in our process that the difference between 90, 95 and 100 are very much similar to the solids. And this allows us to challenge what we do in a slightly different way. Of course, I like to think about our colour gamut in 3D. That is the colour spaces, the white and black point. And again, I say we convert our photos from RGB through LAB to CMYK. Hence that table needed to have an RGB format, an LAB format, and also the percentage of CMYK. I've spoken to you before about the big colour space that we have in terms of our vision and the small colour space that we actually print on. And I've also spoke to you about the industry standard, ISO 12647-3. The standard defines the colour space, the allowable space that we have to print in, and this is the standard that is of newsprint printing, -3. -2 is heat set, there's a -1, -4, and I'm sorry. But one thing I haven't spoken to you about before is that ISO 12647-3 is your print standard. But us ink companies have a different standard to conform to, which is ISO 2486-2. This is the ink standard. I want to introduce you to today one particular key point of this standard because it's going to have some relevance in terms of our printing film weights. The standard has three basic areas. First of all, a conformance of shade of the inks in regards to their allowable deviation. Secondly is the film weight range you can print at. And thirdly is the transparency. But the film weight range we're allowed to design the inks to on the sheet is 0.7 microns to 1.3 microns. 0.7 microns to 1.3 microns. That's the thickness that the ink is applied. Now, this will have relevance a little bit further. There's the details of the actual specification in terms of the shade, the film weight. And of course, me, I love measuring on press. And that's getting a little bit boring, but let's get back to the newspapers. Here's an interesting point. In the last 2 minutes, more photos were taken than were taken in the 19th century. Now, even if that statistic is out by a factor of 50%, that means in the last minute we've taken more photos than we did in the 19th century, or the last 4 minutes, it still shows the incredible volume of pictures that are available to us today. It shows the importance of pictures. It also shows us another thing about the smartphone. Why are they called a smartphone when the users are dumb? Anyway, the eye, with its tremendous vision capacity, still has the ability to receive more information than what the camera can take up. It's much bigger in its capacity to see. Yeah, being Australian, I will admit defeat last Saturday. I thought we had a chance. Some of you maybe thought we had a chance. Some of you are quite happy we didn't show any form. Yeah, I'm glad he's retired. You're looking forward to the World Cup. But anyway, well done. But I do want to remind you of this point, which I said last time. Don't forget, Captain Cook claimed New Zealand as part of New South Wales. You are still all Australians. Which brings me my offer to help. I see that you guys are going through a process of wanting to choose a new flag. Can I suggest you just change the stars from being red to white, and it'll all be very simple. I'm going to talk a little bit about the standard, which really started in Europe in 1993. I also want to step back, something that our specific area, the Pamper standard, that's sort of fallen by the wayside in Australia. The Pamper standard was very much adopting the ISO standard at the time, and there isn't really a Pamper technical committee that's active in this area anymore. And why standardise? Well, there is a global decline in income. Publications are still earning 70 to 90% of their income from print, and publicists expect the most from print and quality. And this is the key to maintaining an income there. Printing to standard in a plant is able to offer a guarantee of a minimum quality. I know this concept of printing and quality is hard to define, but we still need to acknowledge there should be a minimum amount of performance. And there's grey areas whenever we're looking at print in terms of quality. And if you can print better than standard, great. But you must meet all the aspects of standard. In printing to standard, in terms of the press, there's only really 3 areas you have to maintain. You determine your density for the size of your colour gamut. You use your density to help manage your dot gain. And if you get your rego right, that's all you need to do. It's quite that, I wish it was that simple, but they're the 3 core attributes to printing to standard in terms of ink. I want to show you some examples of printing to standard, and I also want to make the point that this particular print from Singapore Press Holdings has a total ink coverage of 220. Now we consider 240 the number. Well, sorry, this print isn't 220, it's 190. And the colour depth is still there. So in bringing a physical copy to you, I want to make you not afraid of this sort of attribute and change. What this sort of change is offering you is the ability to use less ink. But also consider, instead of printing 220, in printing 190, you're going to have less marking set off and all those sorts of things that happen post the print. Singapore Press Holdings is not alone. Hindustan Times. Same total ink value. 190. These boys have taken it a step further. Not only have they reduced the total ink value, but these prints are also at a slightly lower ink density, 0.80. 0.80 status E, but I'll explain that a little bit further. We talk about innovation, and this is one that caught me by surprise. I hadn't seen it before. It seems quite obvious. Here's a nice big wrap. That's okay, we'll put a wrap around the main book. But have a look what they've done with glue. They've glued the inner cover. I don't know why. I've never seen it before done on a newspaper. 20 years beside the presses. Anyway, back to the standard. Any of you seen this? This has only just been released in June from, how do you say, WAN-IFRA, the central organisation in Europe. And this is about the modifications to the standard. It's dated 2013, yet this only came out in June 2015. That's the basis of what I want to talk about. The key points. The objective is to make print buying and printing easier. Lower costs of printers and their customers by avoiding confusion and misunderstanding. So it's about lowering the cost and having a simpler place to work for. And it also has a focus on this 220 TVI or less. Sorry, TIV, total ink value. I get that acronym mucked around. But the standard has been reviewed a couple of times. ISO 12647-3, then we had the 2004 version, now we have the 2013 version. The ISO Technical Committee TC130 is the group of men that actually have determined this change. Very interesting. Here's all the countries in the world that claim to apply the ISO. Now you notice New Zealand is shaded grey. They're not a participant. Australia is. Might be good to be part of Australia and change that flag the way I suggested. The contact for the TC130 committee in terms of Australia at the moment is a guy called David Crowther. I don't know whether any of you know him. He used to work for X-Rite, excellent knowledge on colour space and so forth. Anyway, the standards outline. It acknowledges CTP is now the norm. Plate rung length has been improved. Newsprint quality has been improved. The world is shifting from 42 to 40 GSM. We're much improved newsprints have also got the improved colour gamut. Higher screen rulings and FM has become common. And they've released a new ICC profile. Now, I know I got a little thing where it says you shouldn't read this and everybody will be lost, but I think this is quite an important statement. The new ICC profile created for newspaper colour separation, WAN-IFRA Newspaper 26 version 5 ICC, takes into account the key points I mentioned before. When using this ICC profile in the workflow, users need not worry about specification every time. So you apply this everywhere. The profile has been installed in all areas when converting from RGB to CMYK or from CMYK to CMYK, which includes customers and agencies who produce colour separation files for newspaper printing. It can be an image correction application, an ink saver software, pre-flighting software. They're just saying use this profile everywhere. This has actually been tested by a company in Sweden. Details are in this particular report. So, while I've been an advocate for the ISO 26, I've now got to become a WAN-IFRA ISO or newspaper advocate for the new profile. Do you want a copy of the new profile? I have one here. It's only a K. I'll make it available through Arthur into SWAG website if you want. Also a copy of this if you want to pick it up from there. You can download it yourself. There's the particular details on the profile. What it reviews. Well, this is more about the review of the standard. We're going to look at the application, the original copy. Anyway, I'll move on from that. The applicability of the profile is for cold set printing, including Torre plates and so forth. It specifies the format of the files, a PDFX ISO 15930. This is a little bit above my league, so I won't get into details on that. But again, this point about the total ink coverage should not exceed 220. This is what's new. Maximum 240. The maximum black shall be at least 90%. Grey component reproduction, GCR. They're recommending that be applied. Now, I'm pretty sure that's in most of the files you're getting in already, but this is acknowledging that. There's a little bit of detail about what a PDFX is in terms of what it can and can't do. I'll let the pre-press people explain that. The 190, now I've shown you some print copy at 190. It says maximum 220, 190. This was an interesting statement. I had to download it. No printing process in the world allows for the overprinting of cyan, magenta and black with 100% inking, which would correspond to a total ink coverage of 400%. How many people have printed a file which is 400%? Shouldn't be there, should it? But it comes through. Let's acknowledge newspaper printing. Due to the nature of materials concerned, ink, paper, as well as the method of drying, the total ink coverage is limited in every case. Well, that's talking generally about printing, but in newspaper printing, we only really dry by a little bit by absorption. This is especially true in newspaper printing. The ink does not genuinely dry, but only partially penetrates into the paper. So this particular profile has been set up acknowledging the lower total ink value, 220. It's also talking in this standard about the necessity to get the ink film weights down to reduce show-through because of the move to 40 and 42 GSM. Well, I know we're already at 42 GSM and we're having a little bo peep at 40 GSM. Whoops, that's what I'm doing wrong. In terms of the standard, there's a comment about elliptical dots. Does anybody use elliptical dots? I thought not. Also screen angles. In terms of dots and dot size and shape, size does matter. An elliptical dot joins at the 40 and 60%. Now, one of the reasons why they join at the 40 and 60% is to reduce the effect as you go up the tone scale. So if you look down at the bottom, you'll actually see a screen clash at about the 40 and 60. If you use a round dot, which is what more of us use, get a screen clash at the 50, but it's bigger. So if you use an elliptical dot, it halves the problem. And this is for when you've got these little genuine shade graduations in this type of advertising as you go across a screen area. Now, one of the reasons why the 50% and the round dot has a little bit of a disadvantage is because that's the colour of skin tones. They're around the 50%. So the standard is acknowledging that and is recommending a round dot. By the way, that was in the standard before. We just never really adopted it. This is an interesting slide. We look at the process of AM versus FM. And I sort of looked at this and I thought a calculation might be very interesting. A 100-line screen has a dot 0.1 millimetre in size. A 200-line screen, 0.05 millimetres in size. An FM dot is 0.04, but the standard actually says 0.04 plus or minus 10, so it could be 0.05 to 0.03. They're pretty small dots. Now, this next slide I'm going to show you was part of an Indian presentation. And it was looking at how the different dot sizes and the amount of ink that was carried would affect a property such as show-through. But I know all you guys are really thinking this through, and having heard what the dot size being 0.1 to 0.05 millimetres or 100 microns to around 50 microns, you're thinking men, because you also listened to what I said about the standard. And the ink film on the paper is only 1 micron. So this slide actually misrepresents what FM will do for you in terms of the amount of ink going onto the paper. There's only 1 micron of film on 100 microns of a standard dot, or 1 micron of film on a 40 micron FM screen. But of course, these FM screenings have some great visual advantages. And when we go to finer FMs, it's even better again. They've got great tonal stuff. Also in optical dot gain, you use less ink. The typical undercut that Richmond had on their FM process when they were printing FM was 12% in the mid-tones. That had to save some ink. But we come back to the problem of show-through or print-through. Hang on, I'll get this right. Print-through equals strike-through plus show-through. That's the definition of the equation. I redefine it in terms of ink. Strike-through, which is the ink contribution, is print-through minus show-through. That seems like just a little bit of semantics, but let me show you in terms of a lab print what that actually means. Show-through is when you put a sheet of white paper over the surface of the print, you see how much colour comes through. Print-through is when you turn the print over and the result. And the difference between the two is the amount of strike-through, the amount of ink can contribute to that. As we walk down this 40 GSM pathway, this equation will have increasing relevance. Another part of the standard is the printing plates now have a specification of 1.5% dot variation across the plate. The newsprint shade has a definition of the LAB numbers. I just want to make one point about newsprint shade, is my inks are transparent. That's what I have to do according to the standard. And the whiteness of the paper shows how much white will be reflected through the ink. So the darker the paper, the darker the colour gamut. The ISO standard has some information in terms of the LAB colour space, and there's been a slight change in the magenta, and there's also some variations and deviations you're allowed to have. We can determine our colour space with density. We measure the LAB at that particular density, and we look at the delta E. Delta E versus density, and it shows a minimum point here. And here in this particular case, we can see at 0.92, our colour shade is as close to the standard as we could be because our delta E is the lowest on a particular newsprint. This is what determines the colour gamut, is this type of exercise. Here is a typical profile, and you'll notice that the delta E on the yellow is particularly big. I'll show you what that means in terms of colour gamut. The yellow being up the top shows we're outside the standard. Not a bad place to be outside. We said we could print better than standard. That's acceptable. That's all okay. Means our profile needs a little bit of modification, or we need to generate our own, or we just cut our yellow density. That'll bring it back. That was in the flat direction of the AB values. This is now in the L direction. And I want you to take particular attention to the bottom. This point here, the black point. This is more where the 220, 240%. I'll just go to the next slide. Again, the same black point. This is now through the B value rather than the A value. This is where you're cutting, this is where you're going to have a little bit of effect in going from 240 down to 220 or down to 190, as I've demonstrated here on the floor. This is where you're going to save ink. It doesn't affect the top part of the profile. It only affects this bottom point, the dark areas. But it actually doesn't affect it because the black compensates for it. To move on, there's a Regio specification, maximum of 200 microns, 0.2 millimetres, 2 dots. Everybody think that's a fair thing? That's what the standard is, so if a customer's complaining and your Regio's outside that, You should be able to say, hang on, I'm printing to standard. There's been a slight modification in the dot gain curve, only to make it a little bit rounder and a little bit more technically nice. And the dot gain curve, I think the key point about dot gain curves is that your CMYK curves should match each other in the midtone. If they don't, then your press is out of balance. And that becomes back to a plate or a particular unit issue in terms of your undercut or your packing on your blanket, blah, blah. Specification, the density. I'm going to have to race through this because I'm almost out of time. It says information only, and it says density status E. These numbers look very similar to what we're used to. We preach 85, 90, 90, status T. There you'll find them down below. Status E, status T, status quo. Probably means the same. Status E polar versus status T non-polar. The one advantage of using status E polar is there's very little change between your wet and dry density. Status E polar relative. This particular density measurement method takes away the effect of the paper. Our standard of what we've used from Pampa is status T polar absolute. In other words, we measure including the paper. A couple of things about the filters, the little bit of difference that we have in the yellow, where that affects the curve. We use our density range to define the difference between the light and dark, and again this can be reflected back in LABs and what our tolerance should be. And basically a density difference of plus or minus 0.1 should lead to about a delta E of 3. There's been a slight change to the grey balance. There is a definition for our enhanced paper in terms of a colour gamut. But I want to sort of close off by saying ISO printing for the printer and quality printing has 3 simple targets: density, dot gain and rego. The rest is pre-press colour management. Also I want to acknowledge the Poms in beating the Aussies in terms of the cricket. But also one interesting fact, in the last 14 test series, it's gone to the home side 13 times. It was only the Poms who won in Australia, which has been the odd man out. So if you're a betting man, back the home side and the Ashes in the future. Also, the Diamonds, they had a bit of a win on Saturday. Can't let you get away with that rugby win. Also our Australian cricketers, they beat the Poms in terms of the Ashes over there. I want to show you this series of photos and just reflect on the power of pictures in terms of what we do in terms of printing. We know what this is. This is what happened in China. The information I got at the time I put this presentation together was there was a fire and a group of firemen went in and they put water, and there happened to be some calcium carbide, and the water reacted with calcium carbide to produce acetylene. The acetylene is highly flammable and exploded. That then created another fire with the nitrous oxide that was there. That was the second explosion. In that second explosion there was something cyanide that also got released. That huge disaster. All out of some people trying to do good, a few firemen going in there and trying to stop it happen. Same as 9/11, the firemen ended up getting killed. In closing, why standardise when a paper only has a very limited shelf life? It is true readers do not complain about many of the quality errors while advertisers do. But unless a publisher delivers an excellent reading, it is hard to retain both the reader and the advertiser. Bad reproduction results in a loss of readers and a loss of revenue. It's our industry. And I say this in all passion. A bad copy to a reader is a reflection on us all, not the individual print site. I don't know whether you'll all agree with that with me, but I think with the way it's harder to compete with the smartphone, It is terribly important. Thank you for your time.
And you're right, I think, from a standards perspective, and we'll discuss that quite a bit this year in different areas, and particularly in relation to Pride and Print as well, where we've seen, such a great level of improvement over the years, and it makes it a lot tougher decision for the judges to sort out supreme awards. We've seen, qualities get better and better across all sectors of the printing industry, so that's fantastic, and we want to keep the newspaper and heat set market at the top of that echelon as well. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.